When I'm ready to start writing my first draft, how do I make sure I can find and retrieve all the ideas I've written in my planning phase quickly and efficiently? The answer is descriptive headings. This means I'll never have to reread or remember where I've saved a story idea until I'm ready to use it. A descriptive heading should immediately tell us three things about any story idea. The first is what's happening and who it involves. The second is what its focus is. And the third is if I were to locate it in my story, where would I find it? Let's tackle the first question. What's happening and who it involves. I want a single line that states exactly what's happening as simply as possible and who the key characters are. How about main character describes the estate she lives in and where the murder happened? I could add in with her husband, so the description now reads, main character describes the estate she lives in with her husband and where the murder happened, but it's overcomplicated because the husband isn't explicitly featured, nor is he an active participant in whatever's going on here, so I'm going to stick with the original. Main character describes the estate she lives in and where the murder happened. This short description tells me exactly what's in the passage without having to reread or even skim it. And that's the first question answered. Now let's answer the second question. What is the focus of this passage? In any story, there are three main points of focus: character, plot, and setting, but it leaves out something important. And that would be the nuanced elements and details that soften a sharp story and add depth and meaning beyond simply character, plot, and setting. And it's what ties all three together. I'm going to call that a story element and make it an official fourth point of focus. A story element could cover anything we can't link to a specific character, plot point, or setting right now, when all we're doing is coming up with ideas. A story element could be a theme we want to explore, a symbol or motif we want to insert, an allegory or metaphor, or even a fragment of a concept. For example, this would be a great place to insert a dad joke. In the early stages, when we're only coming up with ideas, we'll flag an idea as a story element if we're not sure where or even if it will fit, and decide later on when we know the full picture. All we need to know now is that we believe it would make a great addition to our story. How then do we figure out what our idea's focus is? Let's rephrase the question. If I could only take one thing away from the story idea I've just written, what would it be? Firstly, if it's about a character, we could try to get a feel of their personalities or way of thinking through their inner thoughts, their dialogue, or even their actions. Inner thoughts reveal the way characters think about themselves and others. Are they sincere or are they pessimistic? Do they think everyone has an agenda, even if there's no evidence to suggest that they're being anything other than genuinely kind? Dialogue could show that maybe what a character says isn't what they mean, or that it doesn't align with how they think or their inner thoughts. This could be a character flaw or foreshadowing an unreliable narrator. Actions show whether our characters are genuine or performative. Maybe they want to be perceived in a certain way in public, but behind closed doors, they're a completely different person. Writing in these subtle differences that readers won't detect in a first read could be the key to hiding clues in plain sight in a thriller or mystery or even a fantasy, and could set your storytelling apart from other writers. Secondly, if our story idea is focused on the setting, then the crux of what we've written will try to anchor or situate the reader. Or let's try it this way. If we voice recorded our story idea, just say it out loud on our phone, record it, close our eyes, and play it back as though we're listening to an audiobook, what would be the picture that forms in our mind's eye? Maybe we'd visualize that we're standing in the open plan living area of a 3-bedroom family home looking into the kitchen from the lounge. That the tall glass sliding doors that frame the entire living area wall to wall are wide open, so the sound of waves crashing against the rocks beneath the house is deafening. Maybe instead of focusing on the roaring sea and how the breeze is blowing our hair out of place, we're admiring the earthy shade of the walnut cupboards and how they perfectly contrast the white porcelain floor tiles. But that's when we notice the red liquid dripping over the extended lip of the black and white marbled countertops pooling at the foot of the leather high chair. It's overkill, but you get the picture. We're setting the scene with description. Thirdly, if the focus is the plot, which is the actual story, characters will act more like participants than influential decision makers who drive the story. because in plot-focused scenes, characters react to whatever's going on, and it's this reactivity that moves the characters from one setting to the next setting where there's more action and more or different characters. And we repeat this pattern for as long as it takes to advance the plot to get the main characters to where they need to be. Ideas that are plot focused are action heavy, and the dialogue is all about let's follow the clues. It moves the story forward without the characters getting in the way with drama, overthinking, overtalking, or anything that stalls the action. It doesn't even have to be clever, just quick, clear, and simply written because the pace is a mile a minute. It's meant to make the reader read faster, not make the reader feel as though they're getting lost. When the focus is the plot, all we know is what happens and what happens next, and so on. And fourth, or lastly, if our idea is a story element, like a theme or a symbol or half a concept we dreamed about one night, it'll be obvious that we can only add it to our story after we know what our story is about, who our characters are, and what our setting looks like. Because as a concept, we won't be sure where or even if our story element will fit, because we can't attach it to a character setting or plot point right now. Let's look at two examples to show you what a story element could look like. For a murder mystery, it could be something as nondescript as character X takes a sip of water every time the killer is mentioned. This idea is so clever, we just can't get it out of our heads. We don't know who character X is, we don't even know who the killer is, so we can't put it anywhere right now because it doesn't belong anywhere as a standalone idea. This is clearly something we can incorporate after our first draft. A symbolic example could be that there are always lemons in scenes where character-wise backstory is brought up. They're eating lemon meringue pie or adding the juice of a lemon to a fish dish, or there's a citrus scent in the air. When we, the writers, eventually reveal the reason lemons are important, readers are going to think, that actually makes sense. Because it can't be lemons for lemon's sake. It has to mean something, a core memory, whether good or bad, that's attached to lemons. I'll say it again. If we have an idea that's a concept and we can't put it anywhere right now, but we know it will enrich and add depth to our storytelling capabilities, then it's a story element, and we'll make a note of it now to include it at a later stage when the story, characters, and setting allows us to do so in a cohesive way that will blow the reader's mind. Getting back to the story idea on the page, it's crystal clear that the focus is the setting. I'm trying to paint a picture so readers can truly visualize and be able to form a vivid mental image of where everything is going to go down, which is clearly in this creepy forest estate. Let's add the focus, which is the setting, to my descriptive heading. Remember, the first part of my descriptive heading tells me exactly what's happening and who the key characters are, which is main character describes the estate she lives in and where the murder happened. And now that I know that my focus is the setting, if I add it before my short description, then before I even read it, I'll already know it's all about the setting. My focus literally focuses my descriptive heading. So naturally, the best place to place the focus is before the short description. And this is what I do. I've now answered 2 out of the 3 questions and already have so much information. It's crystal clear that adding focus to my short descriptive heading has strengthened it significantly. And now that we're done with question 2, there's just one more piece of information that will completely transform my story idea from something that exists in the ether floating around with nowhere to go into an idea that I can place in exactly the right spot in my story before I've even started writing my first draft. So let's answer the third and final question, which is, where could I locate this idea in my story? How to think about this is, if we included this exact passage in our completed story, just imagine it's completed for a second, where would we find it? Or better yet, what directions would we give a reader who wanted to find it? Drop me a pin because I literally need a location, like with Google Maps, something that will help me navigate to the right location in my story, provided that my story has a map. And the only way to map a story is with story structure. I've been through story structure many times in many formats across all platforms, but here it is briefly for context, and I have a few examples coming up so we can all move forward with a basic understanding together. What we need to know for today's video is that to assign a location to a story idea, we need to know the 8 pillars or points or phases of story structure. Visually, this is what it looks like. It has 8 distinct parts, and if you add all 8 parts up, you end up with a completed story. This is true whether you're writing a full-length manuscript, a novella, or a short or micro story. So when I decide that I know where my story idea fits, I'll add a location to it ranging from 1 to 8. If I believe my story idea best represents the hook, I'll label it 1 out of 8. Or if I think it could fit somewhere in the second chunk of rising action, I'll label it 6 out of 8, where 8 represents the total number of parts in the basic story structure that I use. I keep the 8 to remind myself that my story is divided into 8 major parts. If the story structure you've always worked with is 5 or 7 or 9 or 11 parts, you can label it accordingly, whatever you're comfortable to work with. For me, it's 8, and I'll be using this exact 8-part story structure in my write-along series. Now, the key takeaway from my story structure videos is that we can estimate where our story ideas fit along the timeline just by looking at how developed our characters are and, of course, exactly what's happening in the story. For example, is the character naive, impatient, and making terrible decisions? This story idea likely belongs somewhere in the first chunk of rising action, or 4 out of 8. Or is the character exhibiting wisdom or problem-solving skills beyond their years? This idea probably fits in the second chunk of rising action, and that too, somewhere closer to the climax depending on the exact plot point, or 6 out of 8. Does the narration or inner thoughts reveal how our main character feels about other characters? We could be in the setup, or in the first chunk of rising action, where we're getting the main character's initial thoughts about the new characters they're meeting, which could be either 2 out of 8 or 4 out of 8. Does what's happening feel like the main character needs to make a big decision or decide between two opposing parts and they're utterly confused or torn up emotionally? This sounds like we're at the inciting incident where the main character needs to choose between life as it is and going down a path that will forever change them. Or maybe they don't even have a choice. This would represent 3 out of 8. Does it feel as though everyone's against the main character, as though the main character can't do anything right, and which makes them feel like they should give up? This feels like we've arrived at the midpoint, or 5 out of 8. This is a pivotal moment where the main character loses all hope. But at the same time, plot point-wise, it feels as though something big is about to happen, a true revelation that will restore the main character's faith in their journey. This would be the midpoint recalibration. And if I keep my 8-point story structure framework next to me as I generate new ideas for my story, I might feel inspired to come up with more ideas that actually align with each of these structural points, so that by the end of phase 1, I'll have multiple ideas for each of these major story moments. I do a step-by-step demonstration in my detailed story structure video. Going back to answering the third question, which is, where in my story could I potentially locate this idea? I would say that it could probably go somewhere right up front, because it really does feel like an introduction to something. It could be a prologue, an opening scene, a hook, even the beginning of my setup. But I won't stress myself out overthinking it, so I'm going to choose the hook or the opening scene, which is essentially the same thing at this point. This means that I'll likely find my story idea in the first part of the story structure timeline, or 1 out of 8. I'm going to squeeze that between the focus and the short descriptive heading so that when I read it out, I'll know firstly that my idea is about the setting, from secondly the hook, where thirdly my main character describes the estate she lives in and where the murder happened. And with all 3 questions answered, my descriptive heading is finally complete. But let's do a quick recap. We know that a descriptive heading should immediately tell us 3 things. The first is what's happening and who it involves, which is a single line that states exactly what's happening and the characters involved. For my idea, its main character describes the estate she lives in and where the murder happened. The second is, what is the focus of this passage? Is it about a character, the plot, the setting, or is it a story element? And another way to think about this question is, if I could only take one thing away from the story idea, what stands out the most? For my idea, it's the setting. The third and last question is, where could I locate this idea in my story? Or where would I find this passage if I included it in my completed story? To know this, we need to know story structure. So choose one that works for you. Mine is this 8-point basic story structure. And for my idea, out of the 8 parts of basic story structure, mine best fits the pieces of storytelling that characterize the hook, or 1 out of 8. And now that I've answered all 3 questions, this is what my final descriptive heading looks like. And this is the cheat sheet I'm going to use to demonstrate how I add descriptive headings to all my ideas in upcoming videos by rapid firing these 3 questions now that I've taken you all through my thought process. Once I'm done with that, We'll group all the story ideas together so that they exist in 8 distinct parts. We can take our story further from there as we prepare to write draft 1 by examining what we have and what we don't, by filling in the blanks so we can connect all the dots. I hope you've enjoyed this. Let me know if you have any questions about the stories you're writing, and I hope you follow the write along where we'll be writing a murder mystery story together from scratch.